to another session. I hope you are well. As we start this week, I would like to encourage you to pay attention to some of the things that I might share this week and how it pertains to yourself, to your life, and perhaps to your past. I am going to talk about topics this week that may be perhaps too jarring for a number of people. I will try my best to be as honest as I can, focusing on the truth without robbing you of something that should be said. It will be a sensitive week of conversations. When we talk about depression, yes, we can have symptoms on the physical understanding or level, on the mental, psychological level, or on the spiritual level. We have been on the spiritual, you might say, theme for the past many sessions. And what I would like to do is connect the spiritual side with our past and how, for most of us, our pain, our anxiety, our suffering, our fear, our depression has something to do with our past. In this particular instance, pasts with regards to family, environment, relationships, friends, parents. And so I titled today's session, which is, I guess, in many ways, the beginning of what I consider to be the end of this week. I'm starting with the end in mind. And I've called today's session Deliberate Forgetfulness. Deliberate Forgetfulness. Now, today's session will make sense by the end of this week, because as I roll out the sessions to follow, recognizing that I'm almost starting with the conclusion, I think you will be able to connect the dots, looking backwards. But I think the title of today's session speaks for itself. Letting go of the past, letting go of experiences and emotions that you have experienced or you still experience. Just making that deliberate choice to forget. For most people, not for all people, I think depression is simply a refusal to let go. I keep saying, and I have said in sessions prior, that the present is all we have. Your lifetime comprises of the past, the present, and the future. Your life is today. You are living life now. There is no life in the future. There is no life in the past because it has been lived. In many ways, the past is like a spent check. The present is the only cash available that you can have and that you can spend. And the future is simply a credit note, a promissory note. It hasn't been spent, the money isn't available, but it is a promise. The present, therefore, is all that matters. So we look backwards for inspiration and for encouragement and for historical wisdom and knowledge or discernment. But we make decisions about the future based on what we have in the present. And if you think about your life as you would an investor, and this is an important analogy, investors have no knowledge of the future, but they have to make decisions about the future in the present. And as part of the process, they have to believe, they have to have faith, and they have to have insight and understanding during the decision-making process in trying to estimate the possible alternative futures and the possible futures that might exist. The future is not one simple, you might say, occurrence. There are so many possible futures because it's not predestined, it's not set in stone. There are macro factors that investors have to contend with, and there are micro factors that investors have to contend with. But in any case, most good investors will tell you that macro factors are important. GDP growth, geopolitics, currency variability, all of these are macro factors. what happens in the political landscape. For example, in the UK, last week we had an election, a general election, and investors are starting to think about how the future will be impacted by the election results. All of these are macro factors: interest rates, inflation rates, macro factors. Nobody has a crystal ball, and therefore nobody can predict very accurately what the future holds. However, macro factors, despite being important, are unable to be known with certainty in advance. So they are important, but the question is, are they knowable? And therefore, in making decisions about your investments, investors and shrewd investors tend to focus on the micro. The micros are more available. You can look at companies and you can look at their financial statements. You can look at real estate or real assets, and you look at the financial statement, or you can inspect, or you can actually analyze. You're looking at other things. The micro focuses on what the company or the asset or the investment will produce in cash flow. You estimate the growth of that cash flow over time, if it does exist. You focus on the risk associated with the cash flow, if it exists. And then you think about, when will be the exit time for me? At what time does all of this, you might say, predictions and growth and cash flow and possible, you might say, alternative opportunities, when does it come to an end? And with that information, you can work out the value of the investment. Now, I've used that analogy for a reason. Your life is really, in many ways, synonymous with making an investment. There are some things that are available, there are some things that are knowable, and there are some things that are important. The process of forgetting deliberately comes into the picture when we're dealing with things that do not help you make the best decisions, or they actually hinder you from the outcomes that you want. So, like every investor, think about your life as an investment. And the one thing you're given every day is time. We all get the same quantity per day. Some of us live out the entire day and some of us do not. But everyone gets 24 hours. If you see the day through, all you get is 24 hours. And therefore, the way you use your time matters. And I'm suggesting, as an investor, recognizing that your life is like a company, your life is like an investment account, your life is like an asset, and you are the manager. And time is one of the resources. Emotions is another, perhaps, resource. Your mental resilience is a resource. And those who suffer from depression, you tend to find that depression acts as a cloud. It covers everything and it muddies the waters in all areas, and therefore the lens through which people see life is distorted. People feel unencouraged, unhappy, they lack motivation, and all of this affects the productivity of the individual, the emotional well-being of the individual, the happiness level, the fulfillment of the individual, the art of life and living of the individual. Why? Because time and attention is being focused not on the projected future and what that future would entail and all of its risks, but instead there's a focus on the present, but more importantly on the past. And so in today's session, and recognizing that this is a conclusion to what this week would be, I am saying, if you want to overcome depression, a time must come when you should not try to understand depression. A time must come when you just simply choose to let go. You forget, you move on, and you just decide for yourself, it's over. You've contended with this depression, this anxiety, this worry, this concern long enough, and you've paid the price, and you've paid more than your fair share, and you just decide, it's over. I'm going to deliberately forget. I'm going to forget and let go of errors of omission or sins of commission and omission committed towards me, family, friends, environment, and more. You just simply put a stake in the ground and just say, it's over. I am done with the past. I let go of the past. Now, many people will tell you, and this is where perhaps I disagree with a lot of medical professionals and even experts. Some experts will tell you that it is important for you to go back and understand your past and talk through the emotions and go through psychotherapy, see a psychologist or psychiatrist, or perhaps even see someone who is a hypnotist, someone who can even bring in opportunities, and some would even say use some of the new medications, psychedelics or something similar, so that you can understand what happened and so that you can find closure with the past and what happened to you. I take a very different view in today's session. And generally speaking, I tend to take a different view. My perspective and my recommendation in today's session is life is only to be lived looking forward. You can't keep looking backwards. Yes, the likelihood of closure exists if you look backwards rather, but the risks are asymmetric, and this is why people suffer. It's almost like Groundhog Day. Some people are living the pain of their past every day, over and over again, sometimes weekly, sometimes monthly, sometimes once a year. Something has happened in the past. Yes, you're not happy with the person you were. Yes, you did a lot of very bad things to other people, to yourself. No problem. You've got to let go. This is where the concept from the people of the way, who were finally called Christians, comes into the picture, which is to be transformed, to renew your mind, to be born again, to die to your old self, and to be reborn. And as part of that process, and this is why in the books of antiquities, you see people who are given a new name. Jacob is called Israel. Abraham is called Abraham. Sarai is called Sarah. Saul is called Paul. All of these people are given new names and new identities that indicate to them that it's time to look forward. You've got to let go. Now, the professionals will tell you that it does you more harm if you don't heal. My objection is not primarily clinical. My objection is time, fulfillment, achievement, success, and the good life. The time spent looking backwards might be a productive investment of, you might see, your resources and your time. The concern I have is the time you look backwards and the time spent looking backwards stops you from looking forward. Secondly, there's always that possibility and that probability that whatever you look back to, you freeze in time with that. So we go back to the whole story of Lot and his wife. According to this old story, parable, whatever you want to call it, whether you believe in it or not, there's a useful lesson. Some people come into a city and say to a man who is considered to be a good man, why? And he's told, you should leave this town because we have come to destroy this entire town, because the sins of this town are so great that the voices has been heard and we have been sent to destroy the town. We have searched around this town and we haven't found any good people apart from yourself. So we will do a deal with you. We want you to take yourself and your family and your extended family and leave to a place of safety. And here is the instruction. It's a simple instruction. As you leave the city, no matter what happens, no matter the temptations, do not look back. And the instruction is to be followed without waver. Unfortunately, Lot's wife, along the journey, looks back and is formed or transformed into a pillar of salt. Now, the pillar of salt reference, if you think about what salt is used for preservatives in parts of Africa, in parts of the Middle East, and in parts of, you might say, South America, in the poorest area where there is no refrigeration. Salt is a useful way to preserve food. It's also a useful way to preserve either things of value. Perhaps you fry some fish, or you roast some fish, or you cook some fish, and you actually salt it and you leave it to dry, and it preserves the fish for much longer than had you not preserved it via the method just explained. And so salt, a pillar of salt, is simply that you've frozen in time. That you've frozen in time, however, that whatever you were gazing at, in other words, your eye gaze, whatever your ear gaze, or whatever your mind gaze was focused on, that is frozen in time. And so for most people who suffer from depression, most of you are like Lot's wife. You've been frozen in time. And the image you had, and this image could be the image of you looking back at the city that you just been asked to leave, or you're looking back at a moment in your life that is vivid in your imagination, or it could just simply be a video playing in your mind, relationally, psychologically, in your community, whatever it might be, even sometimes at work, that is frozen in time, that plays over and over again like Groundhog Day. You are frozen in time and you live and stay in that place. And the reason is simple. You look backwards. And my recommendation is there is an alternative to being frozen in time, and that is deliberate forgetfulness, where you walk away and you don't look back. You refuse to look back, not because there is so much to look forward to, because most of the time the future is unknown. It's just a promise, but it is part of the adventure. You don't know the outcomes. But you refuse to look back because recognizing in your heart that if you look back, you become a pillar of salt and you get frozen in time. And that means your suffering is without time or measure. It just carries on. And so my recommendation in today's session as I close is as follows. The art of deliberate forgetfulness. If you go through history, theology, philosophy, psychology, what you find is that the most resilient people were always people who decided to forget. Just decided to forget. Now, many people would say, well, I can forgive, but I can't forget, without understanding the implicit position in that statement. You can forgive, but you can't forget simply means you're freezing yourself in time. And the ideas and the thoughts you refuse to forget are used as ingredients in your subconscious mind to create the future you have. So one of the great things is to forget. Now, some years ago, I was having a conversation, and this is perhaps a personal experience. I was having a conversation with someone, and they asked me about something that happened in my childhood. And they described very, very vividly something that occurred in their childhood. Now, let me preface this conversation, but let me stop and explain two concepts. Animals are given and are gifted with the ability to find safety in whatever environment they find themselves. Doesn't mean physical safety, but safety in peace. And part of that is because animals are created with something called instinct. And instinct has a perfection built into it. So a wildebeest, at the moment it is born, instinctively knows it has to run with the wild, because the lions will get it. That's instinct. It's perfect. It's engineered into its, you might say, the algorithm. Human beings do not have that. We have free will, and we have the mind, we have the intellect, and therefore we have the power of choice. And therefore we can choose the experiences we have. Some of it will be good and some will not be. And I remember having a conversation with this person, and I was asked about a question about my past, my childhood. The person asking this question was middle-aged. In other words, they'd lived for more than 50 years. But they were describing something that happened to them as far back as when they were 6 or 7. And they were blaming all of their outcomes, including their present life and what would happen in the future, on something that happened so far back, almost 47 years prior. And I couldn't understand this. And I was asked, can you describe yours? Did you go through the same thing? And I honestly said, and this is something I have no shame in saying, and I actually have no, I don't feel proud about saying, it just is. I said, I don't know, I can't remember. And it took a while and several questions being presented to me because they couldn't believe my responses. And I said, well, you have to understand, I forgive the past and I let go. And there's certain parts of my childhood that were not great. It doesn't mean they were bad, but they were not great. In other words, my memory, it wasn't captured in my memory because I didn't see them to be meaningful enough. Yes, if I were to sit down and think and go back in time, I might remember some of what happened, but I would be recreating the memory rather than actually downloading the exact experience. Now, this is something perhaps I should deal with in a different session. But the point of the example I'm giving you was as follows. They couldn't understand how I couldn't remember specific elements of my childhood, and especially related to errors of omission and commission that were committed towards me, mistakes made by other people towards me, sins, if I can use that word, that were extended towards me. You might say troubling times. And I said, listen, I have turned the page of my life, and that's what I do most of the time. And when I turn the page, I file the good memories, the great memories, what is good report, or what is honest and kind and praiseworthy and memorable, I file, and I refer back to that for inspiration and for encouragement. The rest, I discard. I care not for the past. I care not for the errors of omission or commission committed towards me, and I just move on. And by doing that, my energy is always only focused towards the future. If someone has done me wrong, I forget and I forgive and I move on. I have no intention of replaying experiences in my mind that are not real. They've occurred, so they are no longer real. And by replaying them, I'm reliving the emotion and I am suffering. And most people suffer with depression because they fail to deliberately forget. They fail to move on. It's as though it's Groundhog Day and you repeat the experience, you repeat what was said. And here is where I conclude today's session. A lot of the repetitions are not true. Perhaps most people should hear this. The way the memory works is that it serves as a filing, you might say a file station of things that have happened to us. Your memory is like a muscle. It can be trained. If you don't use it, it atrophies. And no one actually is born with a perfect memory because it's like a muscle. We are born with an empty slate and we start to file experiences in our memory. But we can actually develop the ability to use our memory well, and we can clean and, you might say, increase the RAM processing speed of our memory by skill, attitude, knowledge, understanding, and repetition. But we all have a memory, but our memories are not always correct. And the reason they're not correct is because absent utilization regularly, we default to our imagination. With our memory, we replay the past. With our imagination, we can pre-play a future that does not exist. But also with our imagination, we can take a picture of the past in our memory and recreate in our imagination a picture that we believe to be the exact replica of the past. Now, here is the key part of all of that. Most of what we think occurred in the past and that are filed in our memories have huge errors. I mean, the errors, or you might say the margin of errors, is so huge that most of the time it's not unusual to say the further back the memory or the experience, the more of a windage factor you have to include, the more errors you have in said experience, which is part of the reason why you can have two sisters who were present 20 years ago when something happened, and both of them give two descriptions or narrations of what occurred, and both are different. And you're wondering, well, hang on, if both of you had the same experience, you were there physically, how is it possible that your recollections of what took place are vastly different? And the answer is simple. Some people's memory are more developed, and therefore they file the information because they relive it every day, and some others are weaker, and therefore they recreate what they believe to have been all the sins and the errors and the things that occurred, and they hold that to be true. And no one really knows the truth, because the way our minds work is that we are simply bringing forward a picture, an image, except for where it's captured in video. Our minds are playing games with us. And therefore, if you're suffering from depression, keep in mind that this god of depression that you're subscribing to is feeding you sometimes memories that are false. And therefore, your suffering is unnecessary, but it can be stopped. And I'm suggesting, as I conclude today's session, which represents a conclusion for this week, you have to just learn how to deliberately forget. Just let go. Let go and let God. You've paid the price for you might say, for your depression. You don't have to keep paying. And I'm stunned at how many people wake up every morning and they pay a full price. They pay the same price, sometimes even they pay more than they paid the prior day. You don't have to suffer only by choice. Depression is a suffering that comes to most people by choice. Now, with that said, I thank you for today's session, and in the session that follows, we'll begin an explanation for what I've just covered, and then you can connect the dots backwards.